The gavel fell not like a crack of thunder, but like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. A soft, final thud that echoed in the cavernous silence of the Ozark County courtroom. The sound seemed to suck all the air from Jack Callahan's lungs. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the judge, a man whose face was a mask of practiced neutrality, but whose eyes held a flicker of something Jack couldn't quite name. Pity? Annoyance? It didn't matter. In the matter of the Herons. Landing Estates Homeowners Association versus Callahan. The judge's voice droned, sterile and detached. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The 1,500 acres pursuant to the contested covenant and subsequent lien filings are hereby forfeited. Forfeited. The word was alien. A legal term for theft. Jack felt a cold wave wash over him, the kind you feel just before the shock of an injury sets in. Across the aisle, Brenda Davenport, president of the HOA, allowed a smile to break through her meticulously sculpted mask of concern. It was a small, tight thing, a victor's smile that didn't reach her cold, blue eyes. She smoothed the lapel of her beige blazer, the color of mandated conformity, and met Jack's stare for a fraction of a second. In that glance was the entire story. The petty notices, the escalating threats, the manufactured scandal, the slow, grinding pressure of a war he never wanted to fight. He had lost. His grandfather's land, the rolling hills of hickory and pine, that had been in his family since the Louisiana Purchase, was gone. Just like that. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this HOA power reaches. The clock rewound 6 months. It didn't start with a lawsuit. It started with a mailbox. Jack had been back on the property for less than a year, having inherited the sprawling, untamed acreage after his grandfather passed. After 15 years as a surveyor with the Army Corps of Engineers, mapping terrain from the deserts of Iraq to the floodplains of the Mississippi, the quiet solitude of the Ozark Hills felt like coming home for the first time. The air was different. Here, thick with the smell of damp earth, cedar, and blooming honeysuckle. The only sounds were the buzz of cicadas in the summer heat and the distant lapping of water from Heron Lake. His grandfather's old farmhouse, built from timber milled on the property a century ago, creaked and groaned like a living thing, its pine floors worn smooth by generations of Callahans. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked under the rusty flag of the mailbox it condemned. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the Heron's Landing Estates logo embossed at the top. A stylized blue heron that looked more like a corporate vulture. The letter, signed by Brenda Davenport, informed him that his mailbox was in violation of Article 4, Section 8 of the HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which mandated a uniform black pedestal-mounted mailbox, model number 7B34. Failure to comply within 14 days would result in a fine of $50 per day. Jack read it, then read it again. He looked at the old steel box, its gray paint peeling, a few spots of rust blooming near the hinges where his grandfather had welded it back together 2 decades ago. It was mounted on an old cedar post his great-grandfather had sunk into the ground. Jack ran a hand over the rough, weathered wood. He could feel the grain, the history. This post had been here longer than Heron's Landing. Estates had even been a concept. It was a landmark. He crumpled the notice in his fist, the sharp corners of the cardstock digging into his palm. This isn't just my fight. It's yours, too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. The new development, a cluster of beige and gray McMansions on the far side of the lake, had sprung up a decade ago. It was a place of manicured lawns, identical landscaping, and an oppressive quiet that felt unnatural in the heart of the wild Ozarks. Jack's land occupied the entire western shore, a buffer of old-growth forest that separated their sanitized world from the true wilderness beyond. They were neighbors by geography, but they lived in different centuries. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community's clubhouse, a sterile building that smelled of chlorine, from the indoor pool and lemon-scented cleaner. The air conditioning was cranked so high the hairs on his arms stood up. About 20 residents were there, all looking vaguely similar in their pastel polo shirts and khaki shorts. At the front sat Brenda Davenport, flanked by 2 other board members. She was in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that looked like it would shatter if you touched it, and a string of pearls that seemed too tight around her neck. She spoke with a clipped, precise accent that was definitely not from this part of Arkansas. When the floor opened for new business, Jack stood up, the crumpled notice in his hand. "I'm Jack Callahan," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I received a notice about my mailbox." Brenda gave him a saccharine smile. "Ah, Mr. Callahan, we're so glad you could join us. We were hoping to speak with you. We've had some concerns." "My concern," Jack said, holding up the paper, "is that my property isn't part of your HOA." A murmur went through the room. Brenda's smile faltered for a second. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. The original development plan encompasses all properties with lake frontage. My family has owned that land since 1895, Jack countered, his surveyor's mind kicking into gear. He could visualize the old plat maps, the hand-drawn lines. "My deed predates your entire development by over a century. You can't retroactively absorb a parcel of land into an association its owner never agreed to join." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Our lawyers reviewed the titles. The covenants apply." It was a bluff, and Jack knew it, but it was a confident one. He was about to press the issue when she moved on, dismissing him. "Now, about the unauthorized boat dock. Another violation?" He hadn't even received a notice about that. The dock was just a small floating platform his grandfather had built for fishing. But as Brenda continued, Jack realized she wasn't talking about his dock. She was talking about a fine levied against another resident for having a dock made of unapproved composite material. The man tried to argue, but she cut him off, citing another arcane rule. Jack watched, a sense of cold dread creeping in. This wasn't about rules. This was about absolute control. He left the meeting feeling like he'd just scouted enemy territory. That night, he spread his grandfather's old survey maps across the heavy oak dining table. The paper was brittle, smelling of dust and time. He found the original county plat for Heron's Landing Estates. His property was clearly marked on the edge of the development, labeled as adjacent parcel, not included. The lines were unambiguous. He felt a surge of relief. The proof was right here in black and white, and ink and faded graphite. The next fine arrived a week later. $200 for unmaintained vegetation along the gravel road that marked his property line. They were claiming the first 10 feet of his land as a community visual easement. This was their new angle. He drove down to the county records office, the smell of aging paper and microfilm developer filling his nostrils. He spent 4 hours poring over dusty books and digital archives, his fingers smudged with ink, and he found it. The easement they were citing was a utility easement granted to the electric co-op in 1968. It had nothing to do with aesthetics. Armed with a certified copy of the county record, he walked into the next HOA meeting. When Brenda brought up his outstanding fines, he calmly stepped forward and laid the document on the table in front of her. The thud of the heavy paper echoed slightly in the silent room. "This is a copy of the utility easement for that 10-foot strip of land," he said, his voice level. "It was granted for the sole purpose of maintaining power lines. It grants you no aesthetic authority. In fact, any HOA bylaw is legally subordinate to a pre-existing recorded county easement. Your fines are invalid." Silence. Brenda stared at the document, her face turning a pale shade of red that clashed with her pink sweater set. You could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she searched for a response. The other residents shifted in their seats, a few of them looking at Jack with newfound respect. He had just dropped a small tactical legal bomb into her perfectly manicured kingdom, and she was utterly unprepared. The other board members looked at each other, then at her, their own confidence visibly shaken. This was a crack in the armor. He hadn't just argued, he had brought receipts, hard legal proof. It was the first time someone had successfully called her bluff in public. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. Brenda eventually recovered, clearing her throat and shuffling papers. We will have our legal counsel review this, she stammered, refusing to look at him. She quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. Jack had won the battle. He just didn't realize he had given her a reason to start a war. The retaliation was subtle at first. A new no trespassing sign appeared at the edge of his property, facing inwards, as if he were the intruder. Then came the anonymous calls to animal control, claiming he had a vicious, unlicensed dog. He didn't own a dog. A county zoning inspector showed up, acting on a tip about an unpermitted structure, to inspect the 150-year-old barn that stood on his property long before the county even had a zoning department. Each time, Jack calmly presented the facts, the deeds, the historical records. Each time, the officials left, frustrated and apologetic. But it was a campaign of harassment by 1,000 paper cuts, designed to wear him down. He saw Brenda's silver SUV driving slowly past his property line more and more often. He'd be out chopping wood or mending a fence, and he'd feel the weight of her stare from the road. The air, once so clean and fresh, now felt heavy with a sense of being watched. The smell of pine was now tinged with the faint, acrid scent of her car's exhaust. The escalation point came on a Saturday morning in late fall. The air was crisp, tasting of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Jack was down by the lake, checking on the old fishing dock, when he heard the high-pitched whine of a surveyor's transit. He followed the sound through the woods and found two men, in bright orange vests driving stakes into the ground, on his land. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Jack asked, his voice tight. The older of the two, a man with a sunburnt neck and a weary expression, looked up. "Just doing a boundary survey for the Heron's Landing HOA. You're about 50 yards inside my boundary," Jack said, pointing to an old iron pin marker half hidden in the undergrowth. "That's the line." The surveyor shrugged. "Just following the map they gave us." He showed Jack a freshly printed survey map. It was a professional job, complete with a digital seal from a firm in the city. But the property lines were wrong. They had been deliberately redrawn, carving out a 50-yard deep chunk of his lakefront property and annexing it to the HOA's common area. It was a work of fiction, a legal forgery. "This is fraudulent," Jack said, his blood running cold. "Who authorized this?" "Brenda Davenport." It was then Jack knew this would not end with fines or inspectors. She was trying to steal his land piece by piece, hiding her crime behind a veneer of official-looking documents. He knew he had to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. He spent the next month in a deep dive, treating the problem like a mission. He used his military training in topographical analysis and his civilian skills as a surveyor to map out not just the land, but the entire power structure of the HOA. He researched every board member, every vendor they used, and every legal filing they had ever made. He was looking for a weakness, and he found one, bigger than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't in the bylaws or the county records. It was in the very foundation of the HOA itself. He was reviewing the master plan filed with the state when Heron's Landing was first incorporated. Tucked away in the dense legalese was a clause, standard in most large developments, that a developer cannot unilaterally annex adjacent property into an HOA without the express recorded consent of that property's owner. His grandfather had never signed anything. His land was, legally and fundamentally, a sovereign entity. They had no more jurisdiction over him than a foreign country. The letters, the fines, the fraudulent survey, it was all an elaborate, illegal sham. He felt a grim satisfaction. This was the silver bullet. He drafted a cease and desist letter with the help of a lawyer in a neighboring town, a grizzled old country attorney named Ben Carter, who had a deep-seated distrust for HOAs. The letter laid out the facts, citing the state incorporation documents, and the lack of a signed annexation agreement. It demanded they retract all fines, nullify the fraudulent survey, and issue a formal apology. They delivered it to Brenda Davenport's doorstep personally. She opened the door, her welcoming smile freezing on her face when she saw Jack and his lawyer standing on her perfectly swept porch, which smelled faintly of bleach. She took the letter, her hand trembling slightly. "You can't win," she hissed, the mask of civility finally gone. "My husband is the chair of the County Planning Commission. We have friends. You're just one man." "I'm the man whose land you're trying to steal," Jack said quietly. "And that's a felony." He thought that would be the end of it. He thought the incontrovertible proof of their illegal overreach would force them to back down. He was wrong. He had underestimated her arrogance, her connections, and her desperation. 2 weeks later, he wasn't served with an apology. He was served with a lawsuit. It wasn't a suit over fines or boundaries. It was a quiet title action. It was a legal maneuver of breathtaking audacity. The HOA wasn't just claiming jurisdiction. They were claiming that due to a supposed ambiguity in the original 19th century land grant and a series of clerical errors, which Jack knew were fabricated, his family's deed was invalid. They were suing to have his ownership of the land legally erased and the title granted to the HOA. It was a declaration of total war, an attempt to legally wipe his existence and his family's history right off the map. The quiet title action landed on his grandfather's oak table like a grenade. The legal language was dense, a thicket of jargon designed to intimidate and confuse, but the intent was as clear as a gunshot. They weren't just coming for a piece of his land anymore. They were coming for the whole thing. They were trying to erase him. Jack sat with his lawyer, Ben Carter, in Ben's dusty office in town. The room smelled of old paper, leather-bound, books, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the walls over 40 years. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the window, illuminating the stacks of files that threatened to consume the small space. "It's a scorched earth tactic, Jack," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. He peered over his reading glasses, his eyes sharp and assessing. "They don't think they can win on the merits of their argument. The claim is ludicrous, but they know a quiet title suit can take years and cost a fortune to defend. They're betting they can break you before a judge ever sees the real evidence." The strategy was brutally simple. Brenda Davenport, shielded by her husband's influence and funded by the HOA's coffers, was going to bleed him dry. Jack felt a cold, knot of dread tighten in his stomach. His savings, carefully accumulated over years of service, were substantial but not infinite. He was just one man against a corporate entity with an entire neighborhood of dues-paying members footing the bill for their president's personal vendetta. The fight felt impossibly asymmetric, like facing a tank with a hunting rifle. The first phase of Brenda's assault wasn't legal, it was social. She began a subtle but vicious smear campaign. On the private Heron's Landing Estates Facebook group, posts began to appear. Vague warnings about new elements threatening their community safety and property values. She hosted a community security coffee morning at the clubhouse, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee and simmering paranoia. Jack, she hinted to the assembled residents, wasn't the quiet air he appeared to be. He was a hostile, recluse, A potential developer planning to subdivide his pristine land and build low-income housing, or worse, a trailer park that would ruin their precious lake views. The poison worked fast. The few neighbors who had previously given him a friendly wave now stared straight ahead as they drove past his property. Whispers followed him when he went to the local hardware store. He was no longer Jack Callahan, whose family had been part of the landscape for generations. He was the enemy, the outsider who threatened their million-dollar investments. He could feel their eyes on his back, could almost taste their suspicion in the air. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. Then came the official harassment, a relentless, escalating barrage. On Monday, a certified letter arrived with a $1,000 fine for the unapproved agricultural vehicle, his grandfather's beautifully rusted 1952 Ford tractor that sat like a sculpture under an old oak tree. On Wednesday, two officials from the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality showed up for a surprise inspection of his septic system, a system that had been flawless for 30 years. The anonymous complaint, they told him, mentioned improper discharge into the watershed. As they left, finding nothing, one of them quietly advised him he had some powerful enemies. On Friday afternoon, the low, persistent buzzing started. A quadcopter drone, small and black like an insect, hovered just beyond his property line, its camera lens a single, unblinking eye. It was a violation of his peace, a technological trespass that made the hair on his neck stand up. He knew he couldn't be the only one. Brenda's thirst for control had to have other victims. One evening, he drove through the pristine, curving streets of Heron's Landing, observing. He saw it in the small things, the identical mailboxes, the precisely trimmed hedges, the conspicuous absence of children's toys or personal flourishes. It was a neighborhood suffocated by conformity. Then he saw her, an elderly woman standing by her rose bushes, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She was holding one of the HOA's signature cream-colored envelopes. Jack pulled over. Her name was Eleanor Gable, a widow in her late 70s who had lived here since the development was built. Her hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, trembled as she showed him the letter. She was being fined $500 because her garden gnomes, a gift from her late husband, were unapproved lawn ornaments. She told me they were tacky, Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. The smell of her roses, sweet and vibrant, felt like an act of defiance in this sterile place. She said they lowered the tone of the neighborhood. My Bill, he loved these little fellas. Tears welled in her eyes, and in that moment, Jack's fight became about more than just his land. It was about Eleanor's gnomes. It was about the right to live without being bullied by a petty tyrant on a power trip. He was no longer just defending his legacy. He was defending the soul of a community that didn't even know it was under attack. The legal battle intensified. The HOA's high-priced lawyers from Little Rock filed a motion for a LIS pendens on his property. Jack called Ben in a panic when he received the notice. "What the hell is a LIS pendens?" he asked, the paper feeling cold and slick in his hand. "It's Latin for suit pending," Ben explained, his voice grim. "It's a public notice filed in the property records that states the title is under litigation. Effectively, it freezes your land as an asset. You can't sell it. You can't borrow against it. You can't use it as collateral to fund your own defense. It's a classic strangulation tactic. They've cut off your supply lines, Jack." The move was a body blow. Jack had planned to take out a loan against a portion of the land to cover his mounting legal fees. Now that option was gone. He was financially isolated, trapped. He felt a surge of despair, the walls closing in. But his military training kicked in the part of his brain that had been trained to assess, adapt, and overcome. When the enemy cuts off your primary route, you find another. You don't win by holding the line. You win by flanking them. He couldn't defend his own territory anymore. He had to attack theirs. He asked Mrs. Gable, as a member in good standing, to formally request copies of the HOA's financial records for the last 5 years, something she was entitled to by law. A week later, a thick binder arrived at her door. That night, she brought it to Jack's farmhouse. They sat at his kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee mixing with the old book smell of the documents, and they began to dig. For 2 days, Jack pored over the records, his surveyor's eye for detail seeking out anomalies. He treated the budgets and expense reports like a topographical map, looking for patterns and irregularities. Most of it was mundane: water bills, insurance premiums, pool maintenance. But one line item stood out: landscape and grounds management. The annual contract was for over $200,000, an astronomical sum for the size of the common areas. The vendor was a company he'd never heard of: Davenport Premier Scapes. A quick online search and a call to a contact in the state capitol's business registry gave him the answer. Davenport Premier Scapes was a limited liability company. The registered agent and sole owner was Robert Davenport, Brenda's brother-in-law. "We've got her," Jack said to Ben over the phone, a thrill of victory in his voice. "It's a direct conflict of interest and textbook self-dealing," Ben confirmed. "As a board president, she has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the association. Funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in inflated contracts to her own family is a flagrant breach of that duty. It's not just unethical, Jack. It's grounds for immediate removal and a potential lawsuit from the members themselves." The plan was simple. Mrs. Gable and a few other quiet dissenters Jack had managed to identify would demand an emergency meeting. At that meeting, they would present the evidence of Brenda's financial malfeasance. Her carefully constructed empire of fear would crumble when her own neighbors realized she was stealing from them to fund her lavish lifestyle and her personal legal battles. But they underestimated her ruthlessness. They underestimated how far she would go to protect her throne. The day before the scheduled meeting, as Jack was walking out to his truck, a county sheriff's deputy pulled up his gravel road, a cloud of dust billowing behind the car. The officer served him with a temporary restraining order. Brenda Davenport had filed a sworn affidavit claiming Jack had been stalking her, threatening her, and that she was in fear for her life. The order, signed by a friendly judge her husband played golf with, prohibited Jack from coming within 500 feet of her, any other board member, or any HOA property. He was legally barred from attending the very meeting that was meant to be his moment of vindication. He was gagged. His silver bullet had been snatched from his hand just as he was about to pull the trigger. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. The news of the restraining order spread through the community like wildfire, seeming to confirm Brenda's narrative that Jack was an unstable aggressor. He was at his lowest point yet, outmaneuvered and silenced. He sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the lake, the brilliant colors of the sky a mocking contrast to the darkness that had enveloped him. The gentle lapping of the water on the shore, a sound that had always brought him peace, now sounded like a ticking clock. That's when a car he didn't recognize turned into his driveway. A young man in his early 30s got out, dressed not in the resort wear of Heron's Landing, but in a well-fitted suit. "Mr. Callahan?" he asked, extending a hand. "My name is Alex Chen. I'm a corporate attorney, and I'm your neighbor." Alex was a new resident who had moved into the neighborhood 6 months prior. He'd seen the HOA's bullying firsthand and had been looking for a way to fight back. The restraining order against Jack was the final straw. What she did was a gross abuse of the legal system, Alex said, his voice sharp and angry. "She's not just your problem anymore. She's a liability to every homeowner here. I saw the evidence Mrs. Gable has. I want to help. I can't be your lawyer, but I can be your voice inside that meeting." Suddenly, Jack wasn't alone anymore. He had a team: a quiet elderly woman with a core of steel, a sharp young lawyer with a hunger for justice, and a grizzled old country attorney who knew every dirty trick in the book. but Alex warned him that the landscaping contract might not be enough. Brenda could spin it, claim it was an oversight, promise to fix it. They needed something bigger, something undeniable, something that would utterly destroy her credibility and her power base. Jack went back to the beginning. Back to the master deed. Back to the original developer's plans filed with the state and county over a decade ago. He wasn't looking at his land anymore. He was looking at theirs. He spent an entire night with the two sets of plans spread across his floor, comparing them line by line, his surveyor's mind hunting for a discrepancy. And then he saw it. A tiny but crucial difference in the legal description of the common area, the valuable lakefront property that housed the clubhouse, the pool, and the marina. The state-filed master deed described the plot by metes and bounds, but the county-filed plat map had a slightly different boundary, excluding a critical 10-foot sliver of land that ran the entire length of the shoreline. He called Ben at 6 in the morning. "I think I found something, Ben. A discrepancy in the plat maps for the common area." There was a pause on the line, then a low whistle. "Jack, if that's true, you may have just found the key. If there's a material discrepancy between the master deed and the county plat, it can create a cloud on the title for their own property. It means their ownership of the most valuable part of their development might be legally uncertain." But Jack had kept digging. Following that thread, he investigated the original developer, a man who had gone bankrupt shortly after the project was completed. He found a record of a massive loan the developer had taken out, using the unbuilt common areas as collateral. The developer defaulted, the bank went under in the 2008 crisis, and the loan was sold off to a portfolio of distressed assets. But the lien against the property was never satisfied. It was still there, dormant and forgotten in the county records. The Heron's Landing HOA, which had acquired the common areas from the developer for $1, might not have a clear title to their own clubhouse. Their entire multi-million-dollar empire was built on a foundation of sand. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The quiet title action against him was a desperate smokescreen. Brenda knew about the flaw in their own title. She was trying to illegally absorb Jack's massive, legally sound 1,500-acre property to shore up the HOA's shaky legal and financial foundation. His land was her bailout. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Alex, armed with the evidence of the self-dealing and the bombshell news of the clouded title, would go to the emergency meeting. They had called the meeting to push through a massive special assessment on all homeowners to fund the lawsuit against Jack. Alex would turn their own weapon against them, but Jack and Ben added one final move, a classic pincer maneuver. While Alex prepared to fight the battle inside, Ben picked up the phone. He called a journalist he knew at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, an old-school investigative reporter with a nose for political corruption. "Sarah, it's Ben Carter," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of excitement. "How would you like a story about HOA corruption, financial self-dealing, and a potential multi-million-dollar real estate scandal that involves the head of the Ozark County Planning Commission?" He paused, letting her absorb the information. "Oh, and it gets better. The HOA suing a local family for their ancestral land might not even own the ground their own clubhouse is built on." The act ended not with a shout, but with the quiet click of a journalist's pen on a notepad, the story of the Great Heron's Landing scandal finally being written. The battle was about to go public, and the shockwave was going to be bigger than anyone could have ever imagined. The night of the emergency meeting, a storm rolled in over the Ozark Hills. Jack stood on his porch, watching lightning spiderweb across the bruised purple sky in the distance. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of rain and charged ions. Every distant rumble of thunder felt like a drumbeat counting down to the final battle, a battle he was legally barred from attending. He held his phone in his hand, the cool metal a stark contrast to his clammy palm. He was a soldier ordered to hold his position miles from the front line, trusting his entire war to a small band of allies. The feeling of helplessness was a physical weight on his shoulders. Inside the Heron's Landing clubhouse, the air was just as charged. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile, unflattering glare on the faces of the 50 or so residents packed into the room. The smell of burnt coffee from a neglected percolator did little to mask the scent of collective anxiety. Brenda Davenport stood at the podium, a portrait of calm authority in a crisp, white pantsuit. She looked out at her neighbors, her expression, a carefully crafted blend of concern and resolve. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice smooth and confident. "As you know, our community has been forced to take legal action to protect the integrity and value of our homes. This action, unfortunately, requires significant financial resources. The board is proposing a one-time special assessment of $5,000 per household to fund the litigation against Mr. Callahan." A wave of murmurs and protests rippled through the room. $5,000 was not an insignificant sum. "I know it's a burden," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false empathy. "But it is a necessary step to ensure our beautiful neighborhood is not threatened by the hostile actions of one individual." Before the discontent could build, Alex Chen stood up from the back of the room. He held a thin file in his hand. "Before we vote on an assessment of this size," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise, "I believe every member here has a right to review the association's most recent expenditures, particularly the line item for landscape management." Brenda's eyes flashed with annoyance. "Mr. Chen, this is not the time for budgetary minutia. We are discussing a serious external threat." "With all due respect, Brenda," Alex said, his tone polite but firm, "I believe a $250,000 threat from within our budget is highly relevant." He began passing out printed copies of the financial report, with the payments to Davenport Premier Scapes highlighted in yellow. "I'm sure you were going to inform the members that the landscaping company we've been paying over $200,000 a year is wholly owned by your brother-in-law?" The room fell silent, the only sound the rustling of paper. Heads began to turn, a sea of confused and suspicious faces looking from the printouts to Brenda at the podium. Her face was pale, her composure finally cracking. "That is a simple, clerical matter, a potential conflict that was being addressed," she snapped, her voice losing its polished edge. "A $200,000 clerical matter?" a man in the front row shouted. Just as Brenda was about to respond, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. A woman in a practical trench coat stepped inside, a press pass hanging from a lanyard around her neck. She held up a phone, its red recording light glowing like a malevolent eye. "Sarah Jenkins, Arkansas Democrat-Gazette," she said, her voice calm and professional. "Don't mind me. Just covering a story on HOA governance." The sight of the reporter was like a match thrown into a puddle of gasoline. The mood in the room shifted from discontent to outright hostility. Brenda stared at the reporter, her face a mask of pure panic. She was trapped. Her power, which relied on secrecy and control, was evaporating under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Alex seized the moment. "The landscaping contract is troubling," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "But it's not the biggest secret the board has been keeping from you. The reason they're so desperate for this special assessment, the reason they manufactured this crisis with Mr. Callahan, is because they've exposed this entire community to a multi-million-dollar liability." He held up a copy of the clouded title report. "This document proves that the Heron's Landing HOA may not have clear legal title to this very clubhouse, to the pool, the marina, or any of the lakefront common areas." He let the words hang, in the air, each one landing like a hammer blow. "It appears our community's most valuable assets are still encumbered by a decade-old developer's lien that was never satisfied. You've all been paying dues to maintain property that your HOA might not even legally own." The room erupted. The sound was a roar of betrayal and fury. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. All eyes were on Brenda. "Davenport! Lies!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "This is a smear campaign orchestrated by a criminal trying to destroy our neighborhood." Her husband, the county planning commissioner, rushed to the podium. "This meeting is adjourned," he boomed, trying to use his civic authority to quell the rebellion. "This is a private matter. It's a matter of public record now." "Sir," the reporter said coolly, not lowering her phone. Then a small, clear voice cut through the chaos. It was Mrs. Gable. She stood, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with righteous anger. "You called my late husband's garden gnomes tacky, Brenda. You threatened me with fines I couldn't afford. You told us this was about rules and standards, but it was never about the rules. It was about you. You bullied us, you lied to us, and now we find out you've been stealing from us and gambling with our homes." She looked around at her neighbors, her voice growing stronger. "I, for one, will not pay another penny." Her words broke the dam. The homeowners unified in their outrage. Shouts of "Resign" and "We want our money back" filled the room. Brenda stood frozen, her face ashen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Her arrogance had made her believe she was untouchable, but in the end, it was that same arrogance that blinded her to the fury of the very people she ruled. As the meeting descended into a full-blown insurrection, Alex delivered the final, decisive blow. "For those of you wondering what comes next," he called out over the din, "under Arkansas Statute 18-13-116, a board that has engaged in a clear breach of fiduciary duty can be sued by the members of the association to personally recoup any and all misappropriated funds." He looked directly at Brenda, whose face crumpled in utter defeat. He hadn't just exposed her, he had given her victims the legal weapon they needed to seek their own justice. Back at the farmhouse, Jack's phone finally buzzed. It was Alex. "It's over, Jack," he said, his voice strained but triumphant over the sounds of shouting in the background. "She's done." Jack closed his eyes, the tension draining out of him in a single, shuddering exhale. He leaned, his head against the cool wood of the porch column, and listened to the sound of the approaching rain, a clean, washing sound. The front-page story in the Democrat Gazette the next morning was an atomic bomb. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. For the Davenports, the HOA's lawsuit against Jack was dropped within hours. The entire board tendered their resignations in disgrace. The state attorney general's office launched a formal investigation into the HOA's finances and the blatant conflict of interest involving the county planning commissioner. The empire of beige had fallen. A week later, Jack stood at the edge of his property, the air clean and crisp after the storms. The world felt quiet again. He looked at his grandfather's old mailbox, the catalyst for the entire war. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn cedar post, feeling the deep grooves carved by time and weather. He remembered the anger he'd felt when he first received that notice, the sense of violation. Now that anger was replaced by a deep, quiet sense of peace. The post was still standing. It had weathered the storm. He had weathered the storm. An interim board, led by Mrs. Gable and Alex Chen, was now in charge of the HOA, their first official act was to draft a formal public apology to Jack Callahan. Their second was to call him and ask for his help. They were drowning in the legal and financial mess Brenda had left behind. "We don't know how to fix the title issue, Jack," Mrs. Gable told him over the phone. "Our lawyers are talking about years of litigation." Jack, having prepared for every contingency, knew exactly what to do. "There's a legal process for this," he explained, stepping into the role of guide. "It involves filing a non-adversarial suit to quiet title, to get a court order extinguishing the old lien, combined with a reformation of deed to correct the flawed county plat map. It's complex, but it's clean." Then he gave them the ultimate key to their own liberation. "But you should also know," he added, "that your own covenants state that if the association becomes legally non-viable, a 75% vote of the membership can dissolve the HOA entirely. You don't have to live under that system ever again. He had given them the power not just to rebuild, but to choose freedom. 6 months later, the sign for Heron's Landing Estates was gone. The HOA was dissolved. In its place was a simple, voluntary lakefront association, responsible only for road maintenance and the boat ramp. The rules were gone. The fines were gone. The beige tyranny was over. Mrs. Gable's lawn was a glorious, defiant explosion of colorful flowers and dozens of garden gnomes. The neighborhood was slowly coming back to life, with the sounds of children playing and the sights of personal expression returning to the once sterile landscape. The story of Jack Callahan's victory spread through the Ozarks and beyond. He became a reluctant legend, a symbol of resistance for people trapped in their own HOA wars. His fight had not just saved his own land, it had created a blueprint for justice. In the end, he did more than win back his 2,500 acres. He bought the defaulted developer's note for pennies on the dollar through a shell company, becoming the lien holder on the old HOA's common property. Then, through that company, he formally gifted the clubhouse and marina to the new Voluntary Community Association, securing their land for good. It was a quiet, final act of victory that no newspaper ever reported on. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hills, Jack stood on the highest ridge of his property. He could see the entire valley spread out below him. The twinkling lights of the liberated neighborhood, the dark, glassy expanse of the lake, and the endless rolling hills of his ancestral home. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent of his legacy. He hadn't just fought off a dragon, he had dismantled its lair and salted the earth where it stood. He had proven that one person, armed with the truth and an unwavering will, could, indeed, face an empire and win. The land was safe. The fight was over. And justice finally felt as real and solid as the ancient ground beneath his feet. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people know, the harder it is for them to get away with it.